Brown butter adds a rich, complex flavor to desserts. And cooking butter until it has those toasty bits involves the Maillard reaction, one of the most important chemical processes in cooking. However, this reaction doesn't always occur naturally because it requires a high cooking temperature, or sometimes the recipe just doesn't have the right ingredients. Pre-making brown butter and then adding it to your recipe is the ultimate flavor advantage, and I use it constantly to level up my baking. Now, before we get into making and using brown butter, we have to talk just a second about the role of butter in baking. So butter is a fat-based ingredient, and it provides tenderness, moisture, flakiness, and volume, amongst other things. And although other fats like oils and shortening can actually achieve these goals for a lot cheaper sometimes, butter is unmatched against other fats in flavor. And along those lines, flavor is the primary reason why you'd want to use brown butter in a recipe. And to get that flavor, we need to toast and brown those milk proteins, and that requires heat. Now, the heating is going to inherently change 3 things about the newly brown butter that I want you to keep in mind throughout this entire video. The first is a change in the molecular composition, and that's because the proteins and the sugar in the butter are going to interact with each other to create new compounds, new aromatic compounds, and these are going to contribute to the final flavor of the brown butter. The second is going to be a change in the water content. Because the Maillard reaction requires such a high temperature, most of the water is going to evaporate off. And the last is a change in the structure and therefore the function of the butter as an ingredient. As the heat melts the butter fat, it transitions from solid to liquid. In science classes, there is an emphasis on how the structure of something relates to its function. So for our purposes here, the structure of the butter plays a huge role in its functionality, or what the butter does in the recipe. Is it solid? Is it liquid? Does it cause flakiness or volume? These are all things that we can predict and ultimately control. Okay, first I want to show you a basic procedure for making brown butter. And by the way, you don't need anything near as fancy as what I have here. I just need a thermometer set up so I can show you exactly what's happening. What you do need is a light colored pan to see the color change, a wooden or a silicone spatula for scraping the bottom of your pan, and a heat-proof bowl to pour the very hot finished butter into. For your first time, I suggest to take it slow so you know what to look for, and start at medium-low heat. Stage 1 is the melting of the butter fat. Butter fat or milk fat, you're gonna hear me use them interchangeably because they're the same thing, has a melting temperature of around 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, the butter emulsion will break, and you'll see a separation of the milk solids, which is the white part, from the butter fat, which is the golden yellow part. Milk solids comprise of proteins, lactose, and vitamins and minerals. Stage 2 is the evaporation of water, and that starts in earnest around the boiling point of water, which is around 212 Fahrenheit. Butter does contain a bit of water. It's around 18%, and that bubbling and foaming are a result of the water leaving combined with the milk proteins denaturing or falling apart. Throughout this process, we probably lose almost all the water in the butter. I also like to start stirring at this point to ensure the milk solids are evenly distributed in the hot butter fat. Stage 3 is when the Maillard reaction begins and the flavor compounds start to build up. Do you remember the 3 things it needs to work quickly? It's proteins, sugar, and heat. The milk solids contain proteins, which are largely casein and whey. And these proteins interact with lactose, the sugar found in dairy products. And as the temperature creeps to above 300 degrees Fahrenheit, the reaction proceeds much more quickly. This reaction also induces a color change, turning the previously cream proteins to brown. And there's a scientific term for these. They're called melanoidins. You may also notice a significant increase in the nutty, buttery aroma, which indicates that we are at the last stage. And last stage is when the Maillard reaction proceeds very quickly. In fact, this temperature stage may only last a few seconds. And for that reason, I watch the pan like a hawk, scraping away, making sure that the milk solids don't stick too much. Once I like the color, which is typically a deep brown, I'll immediately pour the brown butter into a bowl I previously set aside. So now we have regular brown butter. It's now ready for you to use in your recipes, but I really want to show you an amazingly simple upgrade. I call it super brown butter, and it's my ultimate flavor cheat code. Simply measure out milk powder, and you can use non-fat, whole, sweet cream buttermilk. You're just gonna avoid malt powder. I tried that, but it clumped up too much due to the added starches, and place that in a small bowl. Now, as you brown the butter and you reach the third stage where the milk solids are just starting to brown, turn off the heat and stir in all of the milk powder. At this point, it might clump, but just keep stirring until it's as smooth as you can get it, and then return the pan to medium heat and cook until the mixture is a dark amber with no lumps. Then immediately pour it into your reserved bowl, and because of all those extra milk proteins we added that became toasted in the butter fat, we've now created a super concentrated brown butter that can act as a secret sauce in your recipes. Now, you may see recipes for a toasted milk powder where dried milk powder is either roasted in a pan or in an oven without butter fat. And while I love using dried ingredients like dried fruit and things like that, I'm always gonna opt for brown butter or this super brown butter over that dried milk powder if I can. And here's why. The Maillard reaction creates hundreds of aromatic compounds, some dissolving better in water and some dissolving better in fat. Have you ever heard the phrase fat carries flavor? When you allow the Maillard reaction to work in the fat, all of those aromatic compounds are then released in the fat. I noticed this effect when I infused coffee beans in oil to make a coffee chiffon cake. When I did this, it created the most unforgettable flavor complexity that I had never tasted in coffee, and it got baked directly into the cake. The same principle is gonna apply to brown butter. The fat is gonna lock in all those flavors that toasted milk powder alone can't achieve. And as for this super brown butter, honestly, I can't think of a scenario where this wouldn't work. I might adjust the milk powder amounts, but I think it's safe to say that I would use super brown butter in any recipe that I would add brown butter to. Now let's get into specifics about substitutions. And the overarching idea here is that you want to substitute structure for structure. So liquid oil for liquid oil, or solid fat for solid fat, because structure, remember, is directly related to functionality, and we want to keep those things consistent. It's going to make a little bit more sense as we move through the examples. And we're going to go from easiest to most challenging substitution. So first up, what to do when you want to substitute brown butter in a recipe that contains oil. Okay, for this example, I'm showing my chocolate indulgence cake, which, like many other chocolate cakes, uses oil as the primary fat. So I'm comparing them side by side, only changing the oil for brown butter. Oil's structure is liquid-like, therefore its purpose in this recipe is to contribute moisture. This is the easiest substitution because oil is pure fat, and after browning butter, we essentially have isolated just the fat. There is a bit of milk protein in the brown butter, but in my experience, the amount is so little that it doesn't affect other parts of the recipe too much. So to do this, you're gonna multiply the oil amount by 1.25 to get the amount of butter you need to brown. After the water evaporates, you should get a little more than you need for the recipe, but it's good to account for a bit of excess due to loss from stuff sticking to the pan or mismeasuring. Okay, what were the differences between using oil versus brown butter in this cake? Texture-wise, this is a fudgy cake, so the results were equally fudgy and moist whether I used oil or brown butter. There was a slight decrease in the height with the brown butter version, which I've also noticed in my chiffon cakes made with coconut oil. I suspect it's due to the butter and coconut oil's higher saturated fat content, and saturated fat solidifies more easily at room temperature. However, this didn't deter me much as the flavor boost outweighs the slight volume loss. The final chocolate cake was so amazing with an incredible depth of chocolate flavor that I'm considering revising my recipe to only use brown butter. My advice if you want to try this substitution is to ensure that all ingredients are room temperature or warmer to keep that butter fat liquid so that it mimics the effects of oil. Next is swapping out melted butter for more flavorful brown butter in a recipe. And for this one, I wanted to show my Crispy-Chewy chocolate chip cookie. It's a slightly modified version of my regular chocolate chip cookie that just uses melted butter. And in these recipes, the butter is also liquid-like since it's melted, but it still contains a small amount of water found in the butter. So functionally, this will contribute to a bit of moist texture and chewiness in the cookie. Again, this is a pretty straightforward substitution. The only thing you typically have to consider is how much water to add and at what point you want to do that in the recipe. And a good shortcut for remembering the ratio of fat to water and butter is 80-20. 80% fat to 20% water. Melted butter in a chocolate chip cookie creates more spread, a chewier texture, and typically a flatter cookie. Brown butter does all these things but adds a wonderful nutty flavor that's irresistible in cookies. What's interesting is that most cookies try to achieve the effects of the Maillard reaction by adding baking soda to the dough. Alkalinity accelerates this reaction by preparing the protein and sugar to react more quickly, and this is usually necessary because cookies bake so quickly, so it's hard to get that effect without baking soda. And it does work, but only partially. That's because we're limited to the outer surface of the cookie for these flavor molecules to form, because that's where it gets the hottest. Remember that we need that high temperature, so using brown butter distributes mature Maillard reaction flavors throughout the cookie dough before you even put them in the oven. There are lots of opportunities to use brown butter plus water in place of melted butter. You could try like a pastry cream. I used it in my pumpkin pie, which is a custard based, and that gave me a roasty pumpkin flavor. You could also try this for crumble toppings on top of pies, or perhaps in a blondie or lemon bar recipe. Next is swapping out softened butter for brown butter. And for this one, I wanted to use a recipe that I didn't create myself so I could walk you through my thought process. And I chose blueberry muffins, written by Jordan Marsh from the New York Times Cooking Collection. And in these recipes, butter must be slightly softened to cream it with sugar. During this process, the sugar crystals carve out tiny air pockets in the solid fat. And this is important because during baking, these air pockets expand from steam and carbon dioxide gas from the baking powder reaction. This leavens or gives the muffin their volume or their fluffy texture. So how do we achieve that same process using brown butter? And will we get the same result as when using regular butter? Okay, we know that the Maillard reaction requires heat. The good thing is that we now have an unbelievably delicious ingredient, but the bad thing is that we have completely obliterated the structure of butterfat. The aeration of butterfat with the sugar I just told you about earlier depends on its solidity. So how do we get that solid structure back? Is it simply a matter of just throwing the melted brown butter in the fridge and waiting for it to solidify? So for fats to solidify, they have to form what's called a crystal structure, or they crystallize. Now, it might be easier to just think about the word structure when I'm talking, because the fats form an organized and predictable structure. And they do this based on temperature. How well the fats and butter stack together affects, how it feels when you eat it in your mouth, how well it spreads on toast, and even the temperature at which it melts. If you've ever tempered chocolate, you've caused the fat in chocolate to crystallize or stack together in a specific way due to the temperature. And butterfat works similarly, but because it contains different fats and in different ratios, different temperatures are required. So I tested 4 versions of Jordan Marsh's blueberry muffin recipe, changing the butter type for each one. First was the control, which was baked exactly as written. I used butter softened to around 65 degrees Fahrenheit and creamed that with sugar. And there is a bit of overflow after baking because all I had were these standard muffin liners and not the fancy tulip ones that would probably work better. Nevertheless, I want you to remember that we have overflow on the control. The overflow of the batter indicates that it was properly aerated and grew during baking, got so tall that it flowed over to the metal on the pan. Now next is the muffin batter made with just melted brown butter, with water added to substitute for the water lost during the browning process. And here I wanted to show the importance of the creaming step because I couldn't do it. The brown butter is completely melted. It can't hold on to any air when creamed with the sugar, and this led to a denser muffin, as you can see. Notice how there's no overflow on this one, and it had a tighter, less aerated crumb. The third one used brown butter, to which I added water, and then emulsified over an ice bath with a hand blender until it was around 65 degrees Fahrenheit and nice and firm. And then I added it to the recipe, creamed it with the sugar, and this one had overflow of the batter as well. The fourth one used brown butter that I added water back into, re-emulsified, and tempered. You'll you'll see that it didn't really make a difference. It's got good aeration, but not any more substantial aeration than Muffin 3. So what's the take-home message from these experiments? Well, they show that you just need the butter cold enough to hold air during the mixing step. Proper crystallization, which is induced by a tempering, stacks the butterfat in such a way that the melting temperature is higher. But this is not necessary for recipes like this one. So the formula for using brown butter in place of softened butter is as follows. You're going to take the amount of butter that you need in the recipe and then brown it. Then, using a measuring cup or scale, get the amount after browning and add water back to get the initial amount. And then you're going to add that mixture into a bowl and emulsify using a whisk or a hand blender over an ice bath. Once the butter is firm enough to handle, you can either store it in the fridge for later use or use it directly in the recipe during the creaming step. And last, there is one butter substitution that I haven't covered yet, and that's when a recipe calls for chilled butter. The substitution of brown butter in this case is the most difficult because the success of the recipe relies heavily on the structure and high melting temperature of butter, and that's dependent on proper fat crystallization. My initial finding is that I can't yet create an all-encompassing formula, so instead of winging a substitution, I suggest that you look for a recipe that is specifically made for chilled brown butter. I did do brief experiments testing the aeration capability and stability of different brown butters, one that was immediately chilled in a water bath versus a more lengthy tempering step, but I need to do more experiments to determine whether all that work is worth the benefit of the extra added stability. I did come up with a good stable version of my American Dreamy Buttercream that is brown butter flavored, and it uses the easier water bath tempering step for the brown butter, and I'll link that down below. You can see my audio manager back here. He's working so hard.